Okay, I think we can start. So hello everyone, welcome to another talk in our webinar series. This webinar is also being streamed live on YouTube. You can find the link on our website or access it on our YouTube channel, LIneA MCTI. Today we have Kit Bechtol from University of Wisconsin-Madison talking about the Milky Way stellar halo as viewed from the Dark Energy Survey. Kit, thank you very much for coming, and I think you can start your presentation now.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for the invitation to speak. This was a fun talk for me to prepare, in part because it's a great way to survey all of the outstanding Milky Way science that's been done by the Milky Way Working Group in DES. And in particular, I think that many people in the audience will be familiar with this work and have deeply contributed to it. So I just want to give a call out to all the people who've contributed to this work. So let's go ahead and get started with the motivation. So I've titled this talk, A View of the Milky Way Stellar Halo from the Dark Energy Survey. And for all the extragalactic astronomers out there, you might think of this as cosmology in the redshift less than 10 to the -4 universe. And I say that partly as a joke, but also because I think that we really can learn a lot about fundamental physics and many other topics by looking at the Milky Way stellar halo. So in terms of the types of questions that we'd like to answer, the Milky Way stellar halo is an outstanding place to learn about the history of the formation of the Milky Way, and by extension, other galaxies as well. There's a huge amount of information that's encoded in the stars, both in their chemical information, their dynamics, about how our galaxy came into existence. Also, the Milky Way stellar halo is a great place to learn about the first stars, the first galaxies, the epoch of reionization. Many of the stars in the Milky Way halo are among the most chemically pristine and oldest stars that we know about, and they're close enough that we can study them in detail. We can obtain follow-up spectra and learn about their properties and try to connect them to the original populations that they came from. In addition, there's opportunities to learn about the particle nature of dark matter and use this as a way to learn about physics beyond the standard model. So the Milky Way stellar halo is a relatively small fraction of the stars in the Milky Way by mass. It's about 1% of the total stellar mass of the Milky Way. But importantly, the stellar halo is very spatially extended. It's a large fraction of the Milky Way galaxy by volume, and it includes the regions of our galaxy that are dark matter dominated and where there are many dark matter substructures. So this visualization is a simulation where on the left panel you can see the stars, and on the right panel you can see the associated dark matter halo of these two nearby galaxies. You could think about this as a representation of what the Milky Way and the Andromeda, these two nearby galaxies, would look like in terms of their structure. You can see that the stellar halo is quite extended, and there's all these interesting structures, and these, in many cases, map onto invisible dark matter structures. So this is a picture that you might have in your mind of what the dark matter halo looks like. So in particular, the disk of the Milky Way is located in this relatively small region in the center of the galaxy. It's embedded within a larger dark matter halo that extends out to something like 300 kiloparsecs for the virial radius. And within that large central halo that's relatively smooth, you have the prediction from cold dark matter models that you have all these subhalos. And the largest of these smaller clumps of dark matter are likely to be the hosts of the dwarf galaxies that orbit the Milky Way. So in particular, you can imagine that a large clump of dark matter like this, one of the subhalos of the Milky Way, might host a galaxy like Fornax, which is one of the brighter dwarf galaxies that's located in the DES footprint. So by learning about the Milky Way stellar halo in detail, we have an opportunity to map these dark matter structures on a smaller scale than is usually accessible. So this is all really interesting from the standpoint of learning about how the Milky Way formed, because we have this view that a large galaxy like the Milky Way is built up by the hierarchical assembly of many smaller structures over a period of billions of years. And so this diagram on the left is meant to give some schematic of how that might work, whereas you go further back in redshift, the top here being, looking backwards in time, you start off with many smaller halos, and then this merger tree is showing one way of thinking about these halos merging together, and then eventually leading to the number of halos that we see, and then the mass buildup of the Milky Way and its stellar halo. And so another way of visualizing this is in the 6-panel figure on the right. This is again coming from a simulation where we have in each one of these panels a realization of a Milky Way-like galaxy, and then the color coding here is showing the density of stars and projection of the stars that were brought in, basically that formed the satellites. And so these are snapshots taken at the current epoch in the simulation, so equivalent to redshift 0. And you can see that these stars that were originally in the dwarf galaxies have made up this pattern of streams and stellar clouds that's really quite complex. And I think a main lesson here is that when we look at the stellar halo, it's not entirely smooth. Actually, there's a lot of information. It's very rich, and it's telling us about processes that happened in many cases billions of years ago, because the dynamical time scale of these stars in orbit around the Milky Way is such that these structures persist for a long time. Here's another simulation that shows how this stellar halo and how these streams, how they would appear at different points in the history of a Milky Way-like galaxy. So in the left panel here is looking at our Milky Way analog about 5 billion years ago. Sorry, let me explain this. Let me back up and say this a bit more clearly. I should say on the left panel, these are what's color coded here are the satellites that have been accreted within the last 5 billion years. So you can see that there's these relatively compact structures that are still intact. And so these most recent accretion events, these would be the satellites that we can see today. So for example, this red, green, and blue, showing the stars that were in those satellites that have been most recently accreted. In the middle panel are the satellites that were accreted from 5 to 11 billion years ago. And you can see in this case that many of the satellites have been disrupted. They've been pulled apart by the tidal forces of the Milky Way, and now they're in these elongated stellar streams and stellar clouds. And then as you look at objects that were accreted in the most distant past, more than 11 billion years ago in the right panel, these you can see have now been effectively fully disrupted, and those stars have been integrated into the halo. But again, their distribution is not entirely homogeneous. There's still information in the phase space of these galaxies. So in some ways, looking at the stellar halo is a way of looking back in time. So in addition to thinking about the stellar halo as a way of doing this kind of galactic archaeology in terms of how the galaxy formed, it's also worth thinking about these ultrafaint galaxies as a probe of the epoch of reionization, when the first stars and galaxies in our universe were forming. So this was a period within the first billion years of cosmic time, likely a few 100 million years after the Big Bang. And what's interesting about these ultrafaint galaxies, these smallest satellites around the Milky Way, is that they are both sources of ionizing photons that were responsible for reionization, and in many cases we believe that they were likely quenched by reionization, in the sense that their gas supply and their star formation was shut down through this process of reionization. And so they're both the sort of the participants and the victims of this process, so to speak. They're impacted by reionization. And so this is another way of thinking about the Milky Way stellar halo as a way of looking back in time. And if you think about the simulations and where these dwarf galaxies around the Milky Way came from, what's interesting is that actually the co-moving volume of the universe that is sampled within the local group today actually corresponded to a region in co-moving volume that was about 40 times larger if you were to go back to this epoch of reionization, if you were to go back about 13 billion years ago. And so what's interesting is that we're actually getting in some ways like a more statistically representative sample than you might expect, because the local group has acted like a kind of gravitational watershed, bringing in the nearby low mass galaxies from this larger region. And so if we could imagine using the James Webb Space Telescope, to try to directly look back at those galaxies, if we could sort of look at a Milky Way analog as it was 13 billion years ago, maybe we would only be able to see the very brightest of these galaxies. However, if we were to look right in our own cosmic backyard, basically looking at the satellites around the Milky Way, we actually have this detailed stellar fossil record where we could look at potentially hundreds of satellites and study their properties in detail. So again, it's sort of thinking about our local group and our stellar halo as kind of this unique record on the past. Just to make this a bit more quantitative, this is a plot of the luminosity function of galaxies. This is work from Boyle and Colchin et al., 2015. And what's being shown here is the luminosity of these galaxies, and then the relative number density of these low mass galaxies at this time. And what's really interesting is that even in the most sensitive deep field observations we have today with the Hubble Ultra Deep Field, and even in the future with the James Webb Space Telescope, if we were looking directly back in time, maybe we'd be able to see an analog of the Large Magellanic Cloud, basically the largest of the satellites of the Milky Way. But we think that actually, in terms of the galaxies that are needed to provide this ionizing radiation for reionization, effectively, you would need to be looking at galaxies that are much fainter, galaxies that are analogs of Fornax or Sagittarius, for example. And these are already the types of systems which we can study in detail with the current generation of surveys when we look in the immediate vicinity of the Milky Way. So another point that's really important to bring up here, I think, is we've talked about galaxy formation, the first stars, looking backwards in time, but another really key point is thinking about mapping the small scale distribution of dark matter and using that as a way to actually learn about the microphysical properties, the fundamental nature of dark matter. So it turns out that these astrophysical observations, they're probing the physics of dark matter through their impact on structural formation over billions of years. And if you think about different models of what the dark matter could be in terms of its microphysical properties, you get different predictions for how the demographics of these small subhalos and their luminous galaxies would appear in our current surveys. And so in particular, cold dark matter generally would predict a large number of halos and abundant population of these ultrafaint galaxies, potentially hundreds of these companions to the Milky Way. But if you start changing the physics of dark matter, giving it self-interactions or giving it some mildly relativistic speed, then you tend to wash out these structures in different ways. For example, changing the density profiles or changing the threshold mass where these subhalos can form. And so we hope to use this as a way to learn about the physics of dark matter. In addition to thinking about the subhalos, it's also really interesting to look at the stars in the halo of the Milky Way, because they could actually be telling us something about the velocity distribution of dark matter in our galactic halo. Effectively, you can think about all these stars in the Milky Way as tracing out the potential of the Milky Way. And based on simulation, it seems that the kinematics of the most metal-poor stars, those stars that formed earliest and have been present in our Milky Way halo for the longest time, that these are actually good tracers of the velocity distribution of the dark matter halo, right? So we're basically using baryons to make some inference about how the velocity is moving. And this is actually of great interest to the direct dark matter detection community, where the limits that we place based on our underground dark matter searches are sensitive to how we think the dark matter velocities are distributed in our Milky Way halo. So it's another connection of where astrophysics can help to inform particle physics searches. So here's the outline of the talk. The first bit was motivating the Milky Way stellar halo as a unique laboratory for galaxy formation, stellar chemical evolution, and dark matter. So in the next couple slides, I'll give an overview of the DES stellar object catalog. Again, this is from the Dark Energy Survey. And then the last bit, I'll walk through some selected results from DES in the topics listed here. So let's move on. So the Dark Energy Survey is part of what's known as sort of a stage 3 set of optical surveys. So you can think about these large digital imaging surveys of the sky, beginning with SDSS, sort of in the 2000s. In the current generation, we have projects, surveys using the Dark Energy Camera, DCAM, Pan-STARRS, the Hyper-Suprime Cam, SkyMapper, and others. And then many of the technologies, many of the science cases all translate into next generation projects like the the Legacy Survey of Space and Time, conducted with the Vera C. Rubin Observatory, pictured in lower right. And so effectively, we're able to map increasing fractions of the sky at increasing depths, reaching further out into the Milky Way stellar halo. So to talk about the Dark Energy Survey specifically, it uses the Dark Energy Camera, this 570 megapixel camera mounted on the 4-meter Blanco telescope at CTIO. The survey was conducted over a period of 6 years. We had an extension due to weather, mapping out 1/8 of the sky, about 5,000 square degrees, about 10 visits in each of the GRIZ Y filters, and reaching a typical depth of about 24th magnitude in the G and I filters, which are some of the primary filters that we use for studying the Milky Way halo. Again, this was possible because the DCAM mounted on the Blanco has this wide field of view and excellent sensitivity. So this is showing one of the 62 Dark Energy Camera CCDs, just showing what a typical patch of sky would look like. Again, this is just a small region of the full mosaic of the DCAM focal plane. The observing strategy for DES was to take a 90-second exposure approximately every 2 minutes. It takes about 30 seconds to read out. This was about 15,000 exposures per year, and this went on for about 6 seasons, 5.5 years. And overall, we've cataloged about 700 million objects, and in any given field, something like 20% of objects are foreground Milky Way stars. So to give a sense of depth in the reach of DES, as early as the first year of DES, we were able to detect dwarf galaxies even beyond the Milky Way virial radius. So this panel on the left is showing the Eridanus II, a dwarf galaxy. It's located at about 370 kiloparsecs away. And so with the depth of DES, we could clearly see the red giant branch, and we could see the horizontal branch. But if you want to study these really distant galaxies, you can get follow-up observations. And so, for example, this is recent work by Josh Simon and company, where we were able to get follow-up imaging with the Hubble Space Telescope. And there we can see all the way down to the main sequence turnoff at something like 26 magnitude and fainter. And so you can sort of see this progression where, with DES, we're able to reach further out into the halo. We can see these more distant objects. And then with LSST, we'll be able to reach well beyond the velar radius of the Milky Way. What's interesting about DES is that we're getting into this regime of depth where we're actually limited primarily by star-galaxy confusion rather than by the detection signal to noise. So what I mean by this is that there's such a large number of galaxies in the distant universe that are faint and small enough that they appear unresolved, and it's a challenge to separate the stars in our halo from those distant galaxies based on morphology, and even their colors in many cases are similar to the stars. So this is the challenge that we face with DES right now. So I want to talk about just what were the ingredients that you would want to conduct an excellent survey of the stellar halo. So for one, you would want depth, and DES has that, right? We can reach all the way out to the velar radius. The other thing that you would want is to have precision photometry, because then you can separate out the stellar populations and really understand how these different structures have evolved by looking at their stellar colors. So with DES, we can use this approach called the forward global calibration model, where we're basically having a forward model of the atmospheric conditions, and we can model the transparency of the atmosphere, and we can use this to obtain a photometric calibration that, compared to Gaia, has an RMS scatter of bright stars of about 2 millimag. So this is about 2 parts per thousand. This is really outstanding to have achieved this photometric calibration, and it's important to recognize that the DES calibration and the Gaia calibration were completely independent from each other. One is space-based, and one is looking at the atmosphere, looking through the atmosphere because it's a ground-based survey, and so it's really amazing to have this kind of agreement. And once you have that level of photometric precision with the DES data, even though it's an imaging survey, we can actually look at the colors of the DES stars and get some information about their metallicity. It turns out that as you change the metallicity of stars, they have shifts of maybe a few hundredths of a magnitude, maybe as large as a tenth of a magnitude in their colors. And so we can use the DES photometry basically to isolate the more metal-rich and the more metal-poor stellar populations just based on the photometry, which is really outstanding. And in fact, we're using this, for example, in the S5 spectroscopic stellar stream observation program to try to select the most metal-poor stars that are likely to be members of these stellar streams. So it's really neat that this is possible with the precision DES photometry. In addition, you can do analyses where you can separate out different types of stellar populations. So for example, blue horizontal branch stars and blue straggler stars have similar colors, but they have different surface gravity. So they're quite different types of stars. And with the DES photometry, you can actually clearly separate out these two distinct populations. This is just an example of what this photometry buys you in terms of the science that becomes accessible. Now, the other piece of information that we could use besides the fluxes of the stars and the multiple filters is to look at their astrometry. And so, Gaia has been enormous in this field. It's Gaia DR2 was transformational, and Gaia DR3 is coming in December. one of the really neat results that came out of Gaia was the fact that you can select stars with different velocity distributions, and this is effectively sampling different regions of the Milky Way galaxy. So you can in particular pick out stars in the thin disk, in the thick disk, and in the halo, where the halo stars are moving the fastest. And this gives us a lot of information about the halo. In particular, you can actually see that Gaia can clearly distinguish between these different sequences of stars, these different color loci on the main sequence that correspond to different metallicities. So with DES, we can try to play similar games. We can match to Gaia, and because we go fainter with DES, we can try to extend these proper motion measurements fainter. So when we talk about the precision calibration with DES, what I want to emphasize is that there's different components of the modeling that we have, and some of these components are static, right? They're aspects that are basically fixed to the instrument, and they're not changing with time. But then there's other variations that are that change from exposure to exposure, and they change on even the time scale of minutes or hours during a night. And so one example of this is the atmospheric turbulence, and the fact that we can see these photometric residuals that correlate with the seeing. We can basically look at a local aperture correction, and we can see residuals going from exposure to exposure, where these residuals, they're only at the sort of the few millimag level, but they're basically correlated with the seeing. And so we can sort of attribute this to variations in the atmosphere that are happening on minute timescales. And this is actually linked, these same patterns of atmospheric turbulence and variation cause astrometric residuals. And you can see kind of a similar pattern when we look at the divergence of these astrometric residuals. You can see kind of the same sort of like streaky pattern like we see for the photometric residuals. So it's effectively the same processes that are giving rise to both these photometric and astrometric residuals. But the neat thing is that these residuals they're correlated on about 10 arc-minute scales, and there's a lot more information about this. If you're interested in these sort of technical details, I really would recommend looking at Gary Bernstein's presentation from the Rubin Observatory Algorithms Workshop. But you can use the fact that you have these correlations on 10 arc-minute scales to basically try to get in, basically model these atmospheric variations from exposure to exposure. And we think that with DES, we'll be able to get the astrometric precision to the level of something like 1 to 2 milli-arcseconds per year in terms of like the proper motion precision that we could measure for bright stars. And so this is actually quite comparable and competitive to Gaia, but for DES we'd be able to extend fainter. Now as you get fainter, you run into shot noise, but I think it's really exciting that that we've shown with these ground-based galaxy surveys that we can make competitive astrometric measurements. So one of the applications of this, using the precision for proper motions from Gaia, is actually identifying the member stars in Milky Way substructures, like for example, identifying the member stars of the satellite Tucana 2 based on their proper motions. We basically see these clustering of the member stars in proper motion space. So this gives us another tool to try to pick out different stellar populations in the Milky Way halo. So DES DR2, our next public data release, is coming in January 20. This will be based on the complete 6 seasons of DES. It has the same coverage as the Y3 release that came out with DES DR1, but we gathered about twice the number of epochs. So the exposure approximately doubled, and you can see that there's a significant increase in our depth. And so this public release is being prepared as a partnership between DES, NCSA, Noir Lab, the Astrodata Lab, and our colleagues in DES Brazil, LIneA. So really looking forward to working with you all on this release. That's one of my main jobs in DES is trying to make these public releases. So it's been a pleasure working with you all on that. Okay, so we've given the motivation for looking at the stellar halo at this point, and we've given an overview of the DES Stellar Object Catalog and pointed out the public release that's coming up. In the next set of slides, I'd like to talk about some of the highlights of DES Milky Way science. Let me pause here and just see if there's any questions before moving on.
Hi, Keith. This is Adriano. Good to see you here. I have a question in slide 21. Do you have an idea of the errors in this for these stars?
The photometric error, or the
the photometric errors.
Yeah, so these are bright stars. So in particular, these are stars that are bright enough to be easily observable with the AET spectroscopy. So I think most of these stars are brighter than about 20th magnitude or so, maybe 21st magnitude, depending on the band. So these are photometric errors of probably a few hundredths of a magnitude.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. For the very brightest stars, we're down at these millimag level precision.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. But it's great because you can see that we can clearly distinguish these different populations based on the metal.
Yes, it's very interesting.
Any other questions on what we've covered so far? Okay, then we will move on. So the first topic I want to bring up in terms of the science highlights is looking at particular tracer populations of the stellar halo. So the idea here is that we can look at particular types of stars and use them as probes of the overall structure of the galactic halo, and also to look for interesting substructures. So one of the most interesting populations that we could study are the RR Lyrae stars. These are a population of variable stars. The most common type are these RRAB that have periods ranging from roughly sort of half a day to about a day, and that means that we can see variability even on an intra-night time scale. Now, given the cadence of observations with DES, we may have observations that are spread out, something like 50 total epochs, or maybe more like 30 conservatively, but they're distributed over something like 5 years. And so, we sort of have this sparsity of sampling, relative to the period of oscillation of these stars. But Caitlin Stringer and her close collaborators on this project were able to develop a method where they could identify variable stars in the Milky Way just based on their photometric variation from epoch to epoch. And then they could do a fitting of the period, and even with this relatively sparse sampling in time, they were able to extract a large sample of RA Lyrae stars. And so by measuring the periods of these RA Lyrae, you can calibrate, basically you can get an estimate for their luminosity. And once you know the luminosity, then you know the distance, and you can start looking for structures in the Milky Way halo. So this particular plot is from the work that Caitlin did based on the first 3 years of DES. That has now been extended to the full 6 years of DES. So these are some preliminary results. In the Y6 sample, there's now up to 7,000 RA Lyrae candidates. They extend out to distances beyond 300 kiloparsecs. So it's quite remarkable that we can see so far out into the halo. When you look at the distribution of these RA Lyrae stars, again, you can use their luminosity, the period luminosity relation to calibrate their distance. You can clearly see the LMC, the Large Magellanic Cloud. and the two large dwarf galaxies, Sculptor and Fornax. Right, so you can clearly see these stellar populations, and this data set of these 7,000 RA-Lyrae candidates, there's potentially many applications. It turns out that most of the known dwarf galaxies and globular clusters have these RA-Lyrae candidates that are associated. That means that maybe we could look for even more diffuse, lower surface brightness structures by looking for clusters of RA-Lyrae candidates that are in the same region of the sky and at the same distance. Other types of applications would be to measure the density profile of the RA-Lyrae stars, again, because they're these excellent distance indicators and they're bright enough that you can see well out into the halo. You can basically use these to measure the density profile. You can again use this relationship with the period and the amplitude of variations. You can clearly see these two Osterhoff sequences, groups of the RA-Lyrae stars. You can fit their distances, and then this is what the density profile looks like, separated for the entire population of RRAB stars, and then the Osterhoff 1 group. You can see that there's a break in the density profile. This is consistent with other halo studies. For the RA-Lyrae population, this break appears to be at roughly 30 kiloparsec, and the density profiles, both in the inner regions of the Milky Way and the outer regions, are roughly consistent with that inferred from other studies. Another population of interest is the ultracool dwarfs. Sometimes these are called brown dwarfs. They're the LT spectral types. So DES has amassed the largest sample of these ultracool dwarfs to date, nearly 12,000. This was a study based on the Y3 data. And this was made possible by using a combination of the DES photometry, the VHS, and so basically having this wavelength coverage going all the way through the optical and extending into the near infrared. All-WISE was also used as part of the study. So this particular set of plots, this was made by Aurelio and company, where what they've done is that they've taken spectroscopically confirmed samples of these ultracool L and T dwarfs. These are shown with the blue and green and yellow colors. This sort of brownish green color. These are M dwarfs. So we basically were trying to separate out these ultracool dwarfs in the color space. And then you can also see quasars in different redshift ranges, shown by the black and red dots. And so with the combination of the DES and the VHS photometry, we're able to make color selections to pick out these ultracool dwarfs. And then you can do studies, for example, looking at the thin disk scale height. And what's interesting is that when you compare the inferred scale height of these ultracool dwarfs, we find that this DES sample favors a scale height of something like 450 parsecs, and this is a little bit larger than, say, the M dwarfs found in SDSS. It's sort of roughly consistent with what was found in studies with hypersubprime-cam. And there's a little bit of degeneracy in the fitting depending on the ratio of the thin to thick disk. But it's interesting that the DES seems to be sampling this population of ultracool dwarfs that maybe extends out a little bit further into the halo and may have a somewhat larger velocity dispersion. Another application of these ultracool dwarfs is to try to find, basically use this large sample that was amassed by DES and then try to pick out the wide binaries in multiple systems. So the interest here is that these ultracool dwarfs, even though they're expected to be quite common, they're such low luminosity that that they're somewhat of a challenge to study. And so we'd like to learn more about their atmospheres, their ages, their chemical composition, and if you can find one of these ultracool dwarfs in a binary multiple system, you can infer some of its properties by looking at the primary star, basically studying them together. And so Marina Del Ponte and Basilio and others have conducted this study of looking for companions of these ultracool dwarfs in DES and in Gaia data, and have amassed the sample of about 250 binary and about 5 triple system candidates. This is the largest such sample of these companions to date for ultracool dwarfs, and these were selected by, for example, looking at estimating the photometric distances to these stars, finding those objects that were at common distances, using the proper motion to rule out candidates where you clearly see some separation in phase space between the stars. And so again, this is an exciting study. Many of these multiple and binary systems, they have larger separations on the order of 5,000 to 10,000 AU, which is larger than other studies. So it's really a unique and interesting sample for this work. Okay, so let's switch gears and now, instead of focusing on specific types of stellar populations, let's think about the structures in the Milky Way, and how these are traced, for example, by stellar streams, or for instance satellites. So for the stellar streams, one of the techniques that we can use to study these in DES is that they tend to have a sort of a similar stellar population. You're looking for these these very old and metal poor stellar populations, and you can basically design a filter in color magnitude space to select these old and metal poor stars at different distances. So for example, you can base this filter by looking at some of the known dwarf galaxies like Reticulum 2 or Sculptor, or some of the known globular clusters, like M2 is one of the prominent ones in DES. You can basically devise this simple cookie cutter in color magnitude space, and then by moving that isochrone filter at sort of different magnitudes, you're sampling different distances. And so we can use this to make a 3-dimensional map of structures in the Milky Way halo. This would be sensitive to both satellites and streams. This is shown in the movie in the left-hand panel, where basically each frame of this movie is shifting that isochrone filter further out into the halo of the Milky Way. And you can see that as you're moving through these distant slices, you can see these stellar streams just visibly appear as these arcs and linear features in the map. You can also see individual globular clusters and dwarf galaxies appearing in this map. So based on the DESY3 data, we were able to find 11 new stellar streams. We had obtained measurements of 4 previously known streams. There's an active spectroscopic follow-up program to study these in detail. And again, these are excellent dynamical tracers of the Milky Way gravitational potential, and we could look for perturbations in these streams to study invisible dark matter substructures. So this was work that was led by Nora Ship and company. So hopefully some of the studies previously have motivated this idea, and this has been known for some time, that it seems like there's this break in the structure of the density profile of the Milky Way halo. So like, what does this mean? What can we learn about this? So one of the ideas that has been gaining favor in recent years is the idea that when we see this sort of shelf, when we see this density, this break in the density profile, maybe this is originating from some massive dwarf galaxy that was accreted onto the Milky Way, and basically we're seeing stars piling up at the orbital apocenter of that dwarf galaxy progenitor. And so, in DES, there's been a lot of work to try to study this radial density profile in detail and to get really a high precision measurement of the properties of the stellar halo, not by just looking at individual stellar populations, but by really doing a very detailed and careful modeling of the full stellar population. So again, using stars with a variety of colors and really sort of modeling the full color magnitude diagram. So this is work that was led by Adriano and company, in particular using a new Milky Way fitting code in the Trilagal population model for the stars in our halo. And what's really nice about this fitting approach is that we can see the contributions at the bright end from the bulge and the disk, and then as we go fainter and fainter, we can see that that DES is really sampling this halo population of stars, and that we're able to get an excellent fit between the observed sample in blue of the number of stars as a function of their flux relative to this model of the Milky Way halo, extending all the way out to 23rd magnitude, so almost the faint end limit of DES. So again, this is confirming the presence of a power law break in this model fitting and getting precision parameters for this density profile. So putting all this information together, we have the strong evidence for this break in the stellar density profile. We can also look at the velocity distribution. We can look at the chemical space. So this is work done by Helmy and others looking at Gaia data and apogee. And it seems like there's this this population of stars that's consistent with originating from a merger event about 10 billion years ago. It would have been a merger with a galaxy that's somewhat more massive than the Small Magellanic Cloud is what is proposed. And maybe this is partly what led to the formation of the thick disk is one of the speculations here. And so again, if this event happened, some of the authors are referring to this as the Gaia Enceladus accretion event, you would expect that there'd be this distribution of sort of the debris of this merger event that's now distributed across the whole sky. So again, this is sort of this really interesting, provocative hypothesis about, about the formation of the Milky Way. So one of the concepts, sort of approaches that we could use to test an idea like this would really to try to get very detailed chemical measurements for as many stars in the Milky Way halo as possible, and basically try to use the unique chemical signatures to isolate these different stellar populations. And then by extension, one of the approaches that one of the really exciting aspects about about DES and other galaxy surveys is that when we are finding these structures in the Milky Way, when we're finding, for example, the Milky Way galaxies, these are thought to be some of the most chemically pristine galaxies known. They're basically these reservoirs of these stars that formed out of nearly the primordial gas in the early universe. And we might be able, in principle, to detect the enrichment signatures of individual events. For example, supernovae or neutron star mergers, basically by looking at the distribution of these chemical elements and thinking about how these different chemical elements originate in different processes. So there's been this active program to perform this high resolution spectroscopic follow-up and really look for these chemical fingerprints in the population of stars found in these Milky Way ultrafaint galaxies. As of this year, there's at least 85 stars in 16 different ultrafaint dwarf galaxies that have these high resolution spectroscopic chemical abundance measurements. And there's at least 5 of these ultrafaint dwarfs that have at least 7 stars that are studied. And so DES has played a key role in this in terms of providing new targets, basically, of these ultrafaint galaxies, again, that are these reservoirs of these ultra chemically pristine stars. And again, you can look at the detailed chemical abundances, to try to study these first supernova or rare events like binary neutron star mergers that may have caused these chemical enrichment events. Effectively, these galaxies are so small and so simple that there's only a countable number of such events that would have occurred in the history of these galaxies. Okay, so in the last couple minutes, I want to talk about in detail some of the population studies that we've been doing of these satellite galaxies of the Milky Way. So when we look out at the at the night sky, and if you're lucky enough to be down in the southern hemisphere, or observing at CTIO, which I love going down to do, you can walk outside the observatory and you can see the Milky Way arching overhead. You can see the large and small Magellanic Cloud. They're visible by eye, and these are satellite galaxies in the Milky Way that have something like close to a billion stellar masses worth of stars. And an interesting question is, did these largest satellites of the Milky Way, the small and large Magellanic Cloud, could they have brought their own entourage of smaller satellites to the Milky Way? If you take this hierarchical structure formation model seriously, then you would expect that the pattern hierarchy continues all the way down to the very faintest systems. And so, indeed, with DES and other surveys, we're able to find these galaxies that are orders of magnitude smaller than the Magellanic Clouds. Some of the dwarf galaxies that we're finding with DES are as small as maybe a few thousand or even a few hundred solar masses worth of stars, and so they're almost invisible. And you have to use these statistical algorithms to try to pick out these overdensities of old and middle core stars. So this has been a sort of a growth industry where for many years we could just find these satellites sort of serendipitously in photographic plates, but then with the start of SDSS and these other modern imaging surveys, we're now up to something like over 60. Actually, I need to update this timeline. We're now up to something like over 60 candidates of these Milky Way satellites that have been discovered. Even then, we know that that these new discoveries are not the full story. For example, the HyperSat PrimeCam survey program is going deeper than DES, but over a smaller region of sky. But they have found these extremely low luminosity and distant galaxies like Virgo 1 that would not have been detectable in DES, right? And so the fact that they found several of these within such a small region of sky implies that there's probably hundreds of these ultra-faint galaxies still to find. On the other end of the spectrum, this Antlia 2 galaxy is actually enormous. It's this huge galaxy, but it was only discovered recently using Gaia proper motions and our Gaia proper motions in our Lyrae stars because it's such low surface brightness. Basically, it's this enormous galaxy, and it's so spatially extended that we just couldn't recognize it until using some of these other stellar tracer populations. So we know that our current sample is incomplete. And so with DES and pan-stars, basically we were able to combine these surveys and do this detailed search for low luminosity satellite galaxies around the Milky Way. We had a total coverage of over 32,000 square degrees in terms of the coverage of these maps. It's nearly the entire extragalactic sky. So I'll skip ahead in the interest of time, but just mention that with this combination of DS and pan-stars, this deep photometry, multiple bands over nearly the whole sky, we infer that there's something like 200 Milky Way satellite galaxies that are sort of in total within the virial radius of the Milky Way. This is using a sophisticated modeling, taking into account baryon physics and the selection effects. We basically injected millions of artificial satellites to analyze our sensitivity, and we came out with this result. It means that there's still something like 150 satellites that are undiscovered, right? That will be potential targets to look for with LSST and Euclid and the Roman Space Telescope. Another key result of this study is that we find that maybe as many as 40 of this total population of satellites of the Milky Way were actually originally associated with the LMC. They were within the LMC virial radius when it was accreted onto the Milky Way. And so we're actually, starting to learn about, some of the key features of the the formation history of the Milky Way and how this population came to be. So just some of the headline results of this study, is again that we have this sort of conclusive, definitive Bayesian evidence that the LMC really impacted the observed Milky Way stellar satellite population. We sort of have this direct evidence for this hierarchical structure formation on the scale of dwarf galaxies. It's consistent with the Magellanic Clouds being accreted recently. And some of these satellites that we're able to detect, they probably are at halo masses of something like 10 to the 8, which means that they're extremely dark matter dominated. And in fact, these are so low and these are so small in terms of their halo mass that we're actually approaching the atomic cooling limit, where we're sort of getting near the threshold of what we think, where you could even bring in the gas and successfully have energy dissipation to form these stars. So we think that as we start going much lower in halo mass, that eventually there won't be any stars to see. They were sort of getting at this range of finding the threshold of galaxy formation, which I think is really exciting. Let me just close with one final thought, which is that there are now surveys that are looking for satellites around Milky Way analogs, but looking at entire populations of sort of Milky Way analogs. So in particular, there's this recent result from the SAGA survey where they've looked at 36 Milky Way analogs and identified 127 satellites in total around that population. So in particular, they're looking at these Milky Way analogs at distances of a few tens of megaparsecs. And the way that they identify a given galaxy as being a satellite is that they basically, they pick out these faint, low surface brightness objects in the imaging data, part of which comes from DES. They obtain spectroscopic follow-up, and they basically look that these galaxies are moving coherently with the host. And what's really interesting, this is work by Yayuan Mao and others, is that when they look at the luminosity function of this sample of 36 other Milky Way analogs, and they apply the model that was fit to the Milky Way satellite population, it's basically fully consistent. It basically looks like the Milky Way satellite population was drawn from the same underlying distribution. And we see this both in luminosity space and also in radial space, where when you look at the radial distribution of these satellites, again, the shaded region is what you would predict from this Milky Way model, and the colored is the cumulative distribution. So again, it looks like the Milky Way is actually statistically representative of this larger population, and that's something that just wasn't possible before. So I think this saga is a tremendously interesting new development in the field. Okay, so let me stop there. I'll just put up my conclusion slide, highlight again just the exciting Milky Way science that's possible with DES, and mention that that DES-DR2, our next public release, is coming in January, so everyone can look forward to that. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Kit, for the very interesting talk. We have now a little time for questions. So are there questions from the audience?
Yes, I have a comment. First of all, thank you, Keith, for this very nice presentation, not only summarizing the work of the Milky Way Working Group, but also your work along the whole collaboration. And the question is about the work of the Milky Way Working Group. I think that there are many areas that were not covered by our group. Do you think that some of them should be covered in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Milky Way Working Group is one of the smallest in DES, and that's partly why I made this joke about cosmology in the redshift less than 10⁻⁴ universe. That DES is this amazing collaboration where there's been so much work put in by so many individuals to make this amazing data set. But the Milky Way Working Group, I mean, it's, I actually, wanted to sort of call out here on this last slide. There's many people that have contributed over the years, but it's still, relatively small compared to many of the other working groups in DES. So I mean, as one of the coordinators, I am always happy and excited and delighted when there's new projects that are being pursued. I think we're mainly just limited by the number of people.
Okay, thank you. I see a lot of fields also to be covered, like let's say the structure of the thick disk, the white dwarfs, let's say, and I think that, yeah, this should be covered in the future. Yeah, but I also agree that a very small group and a very active group into the collaboration.
More questions? Okay, I suppose there are no more questions. So if there are no more questions, we can wrap it up. You can find the video of this presentation on our website and on LIneA's YouTube channel. Next week, we will have Alison Noble from Arizona State University to talk about galaxies inside of galaxy clusters over cosmic time. Thank you everyone for attending, and a special thanks to Kit. And bye, and I hope to see you next week.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.